Yeah, for sure.
Great. It looks like, yeah, we got a few more people in here. So Dr. Neptune, whenever you're ready, we'll, like, as I mentioned, we'll start off with you just telling us a little bit about your history, your career, um, things you like to cover, and then we'll switch and transition to questions and answers.
Okay, sounds good. And maybe Deaton, could you tee it up a little bit and just, you know, help these folks understand how we got connected?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know me, I'm Deaton. I recognize a lot of you, but not all of you. And so I went to Columbia for undergrad and for post-bac. And during my post-bac, I was trying to decide if I wanted to apply to MBA, MD joint programs. My undergrad was in economics and philosophy, so it was just of interest to me. I started a business in between undergrad and post-bac. So my post-bac pre-med dean, Dean Megan Rigney, she connected me to Dr. Neptune. He's an alumni of Columbia and has always been a great resource for entrepreneurial students, pre-med students in general. And so she connected me to him to discuss that decision to pursue an MBA, MD degree. I ultimately decided not to pursue the MBA just because of my previous work experience. I'm 30, I'm a little old for a first year. So it was like time to, you know, get things moving. And, but that was relevant because you all know here at Rochester, you start off with the MBA program. And I just wasn't ready to make that kind of decision then. So decided not to, but was lucky enough to get introduced to Dr. Neptune. And so when I saw that this group was here at Rochester, I mentioned that Dr. Neptune would be a great guest. He has just a lot of experience and a very kind of non-traditional medical experience. So I'm happy you could make it. So thank you, Dr. Neptune.
Sounds good. And that's very interesting to hear that your MD MBA program begins with the MBA. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So I was like, I had to decide like during the application process if I wanted to commit to this, and Rochester was, you know, on my short list. So I was like, yeah, so that's why I had to decide then. I actually did initially apply to the program, but after talking to you, I emailed them. I was like, can you please remove me from that joint program application process?
Interesting. Okay. Well, always interesting to hear the follow-up, right? And hear, you know, how did the patient do after they left the ER, you know?
I'm doing pretty well, so don't worry.
Great. All right. So great to meet you all. And, you know, you guys are all in a very interesting part of your life. And it's so funny, you know, I graduated from medical school in 1997. So, you know, I don't feel that old, but that's, you know, 23 years ago now, you know, so that's really a long time. But anyways, as Deaton mentioned, I am a Columbia grad. I'm actually originally from New Jersey. My parents are from Haiti. That's why I have a French name. But I grew up in New Jersey, went to Columbia as an undergrad, and then went to Columbia for medical school. So, you know, I would say from the beginning, I always knew that I was interested in doing more than seeing patients and doing clinical research. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but my father was a physician. My dad passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a pathologist and he was an entrepreneur himself. So he actually started a number of clinical diagnostic laboratories that I was very much involved in as an undergraduate and into medical school. So I knew pretty early in my process that I was interested in sort of the broader notion of what healthcare was. I was interested in the operational standpoint, and I was interested in the financial part. So when I applied to medical school and made it pretty clear that, you know, I wanted to go to med school, wanted to be a doctor, wanted to do a residency, but afterwards I planned to get an MBA and do an MBA afterwards. So I did a residency in internal medicine at Columbia. And then, you know, right after I finished my residency, or in my third year of residency, I applied to business school. And, you know, I finished my residency in 2000. And then, you know, a month later, I was in a classroom in Philadelphia. I went to Wharton and got my MBA there. And, you know, for me, you know, people always ask the question, you know, did you really practice? I mean, I worked as an ER doc for a period of time, but for most of my career, I've actually been more of a business person than I have been a physician. And I would argue that, you know, now at this point, I probably actually have more experience as a business person than as a pure physician. So, you know, after I finished my residency, I went to business school, as I mentioned. Wharton is a great MBA program and has a great healthcare and entrepreneurship track. And that's what I did when I was in business school. Between my first and second year of business school, I summered at Pfizer. So I worked in the it was like an internal strategy group that reported to the president. And it was when I worked at Pfizer that I was like, a big, 90,000 person company is probably not the place for me. As you can probably tell from me talking, I have like an undiagnosed ADD my light bulb burns bright and I need a lot of stimulation. So, being in an office by myself all day long was not a great place to be. So I finished my MBA in 2002. And unfortunately, 2002 was like the nadir of the dot-com bust. So you may remember, the NASDAQ peaked in 2000, and then there was just a huge crash after that. If I had started business school prior in 2000, or let's say I'd started business school 2 years earlier, when I graduated, I would have had like unlimited startup offers. But by 2002, if you even had a job, you were lucky. So when I finished business school, I actually went and did sell-side equity research. I worked for a company called Sanford Bernstein and did stock analysis for HMOs and hospitals, which was actually very useful. I learned a lot in doing that job, learned a lot about finance, learned a lot about financial statements and financial modeling. So that was really good. Fortunately, I had a friend that I had done residency with who also left the faith, as I like to say, and that's we can talk a little bit about leaving the faith later on. But he had left the faith as well, did not want to be a doctor anymore, and got recruited at a company called Gerson Lerman Group. And GLG is the pioneer in expert networks. Essentially, what we did is we went out and found experts and recruited them, and then used technology to connect them to our clients who wanted to talk to them. And most of those clients in the early days were venture capital funds, hedge funds, that kind of stuff. So he recruited me into the company, and I joined GLG when there were like less than 40 people. And I was at GLG for 5 years. And in that time, the company grew 20x. So by the time I left GLG, we were about 800 employees. And at GLG, I was responsible for managing about a third of the employees at the company there. And that was great. Like, I loved entrepreneurship. I loved being in a startup environment. I loved like the fast pace. And a lot of people have asked me like, well, why didn't you become an ER doctor? And actually the reason I didn't do ER is very specific. Columbia had a terrible ER program, so I didn't really have a good place to get trained. And number two, I always figured that I was interested more in the long-term relationships than the short-term relationships. But from a personality standpoint, like being in a startup was very much like being in ER. People are coming in, they're coding, people are, coming in with stab wounds. And that's really like what a startup is like every day for 5 years. So by the time I had gotten to GLG, we had done really well. I did very well there financially. It was starting to get to be a big company, and the same guy that recruited me in, who is also still a good friend and is actually the founder of a company called Quality Reviews, which is a great company. We said, you know what, we should go out and do something on our own because we're way too smart and we're way too arrogant, and we should go do something on our own. So we founded a clinical trials company, a virtual clinical trials company. And we ran that company for 2 years. We eventually sold the assets of that company to the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So I don't know if they have it anymore, but if 5 years or 10 years ago, if you were looking for clinical trials on the Michael J. Fox Foundation site, you were using the tools that we had built. And the challenge with that business is that it was just difficult to generate a market. Pharma companies weren't really interested in working with us. So at the end of the day, we really couldn't scale it in the way that we wanted to. And then after that, I did another startup, actually a virtual second opinion startup, and did that with a guy by the name of Richard Foreman, and he's known as the founder of Register.com, which went public in the early 2000s. They democratized the market around domain registrations, and again built another interesting company over 18 months, but discovered that the market for people spending a couple grand for a second opinion wasn't that big. There is a company called Grand Rounds now. It's actually a what is that venture company called? Look up Grand Rounds, but essentially what they do is they do something very similar to what we do, and they work with employers providing patients with access to second opinions. So we were sort of early in that space. And then after that, I did work at 2 other places. I worked at a place called Health 2.0, which is a digital technology, health technology consulting and events firm, and I was there for 3 years. And then immediately prior to doing what I'm doing now, for 3 years, I was involved with Blueprint Health, which is a digital health accelerator here in New York. Sort of think of it as a micro VC firm. And I was responsible for making investments in a couple dozen early stage digital health companies, of which many founders were actually medical students, residents, and other people who were building technology for healthcare companies like hospitals, systems, payers, providers, that kind of stuff. So, a long and winding road, and I'll talk about my new venture in a second. But what I always tell people, and I think, Deet, you may have remembered this rap, if you are in the medical world, it is a very prescribed route, right? You go to medical school, then you do your residency, then you do your fellowship, then you're a junior attending, then you're a senior attending, then you do this, then you do that. It's very prescribed. And in many ways, I think a lot of people don't appreciate the value that comes out of knowing what your next steps are, right? Because for me, at every point in my career since I left residency has been, choose your own adventure, figure out your own way, succeed or fail. And I've had some great successes. Again, I did very well at one company, but I've had a couple startups that, were sort of not a zero, but not necessarily a strong positive for me. And that's, an interesting point of view. And Deaton probably remembers me being philosophical in terms of our discussion there. And what I'm working on now, and what I've been working on for the last year, is a company called Suntra Modern Recovery. And what we are is a virtual concierge drug and alcohol rehabilitation service. So actually not really related to my primary residency training, although I have had some addiction training. And what we do is we focus on providing people with access to coaches, providers, physicians, medications, and coaching services so that they can avoid going to inpatient rehab. And right now last month was a record month of revenue for us. As you can imagine, the pandemic has been very, very stressful for a lot of people. So there are a lot of people dealing with addiction issues now. And, we are out there trying to help people, and it's me and my partner and a few other people helping us. And it is as startup as you can get, but it's fun, and it's very rewarding in its own way. And it's something fun to do, but very different from being a physician, and very different from probably many of the people who are teaching you right now. And that's a very, very different way of thinking. So my long resume in short form, and I'll pause there and see if you have any questions, any thoughts, anything I can share with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newton. That was Dr. Neptune. Dr. Neptune. that was really great. So if anyone has any questions right now, please feel free to ask. I also have some that were submitted online to us before. So if anyone has any, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
Yeah, I have a question. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Deaton.
Yeah.
Dr. Neptune, I'm wondering what kinds of physicians you're recruiting for Suntra Modern Recovery.
Physicians, well, it's interesting. We are sort of physician light. Our company is more, the professionals that we use are more like interventionists and coaches, recovery coaches. So those are people, if a physician, let's say my residency was 12,000 hours of training plus medical school, right? Probably 20,000 hours of training to be a doctor. These interventionists are probably 2,000 hours of training. Coaches might even be 1,000 hours. So I actually do a lot of the medical work myself. So if somebody has a medical condition, I will evaluate the patients, because a lot of this stuff is medical, right? If you're drinking a liter of alcohol a day, you're going to have some medical issues. So I do the medical evaluation. And for patients who need medication assisted treatment, they need buprenorphine or naltrexone, I do that myself, but I can do that for a very large number of patients. So we're actually physician light on the team, and we're actually focused more on these, as a physician, you might call them paraprofessionals.
Thank you.
Sure.
So have you kept up your board certifications in order to do that work?
Excellent question. So I was boarded. I passed my board in 2000, first time. I maintained my board certification. You have a 10-year licensure, if you will. In 2010, I was sort of still working I was working in startups. It was not clear that I was going to go back to seeing patients. Maintaining your board certification is expensive, like, several $1,000s per year. So I actually left. My board certification is lapsed. Now, I've always maintained my license and my DEA, which are expensive in their own way. But I can do a lot of what I'm doing now without being boarded. In general, what I would say is, board certification is what you need if you're going to a place that needs to say that all of our doctors are the top quality, right? So like if you want to work at an academic medical center, you have to be board certified. If you want to work in a variety of different settings where they talk, they brag about how great their doctors are, you have to be board certified. If you're an entrepreneur, you probably don't really need to be board certified, because the truth is, a license in the state of New York allows you to do anything. Like if I wanted to, I could do surgery if I wanted to, even though I'm an internal medicine doctor. My license says license to practice medicine and surgery. So I don't really need it. And I have a good friend, her name is Robin Berzin. She is the founder of Parsley Health. They're like the leader in integrative medicine, and they raised like $10 million from First Mark. She didn't even finish her residency. She just did an internship. So she couldn't even sit for the boards if she wanted to. So again, I think this is a perfect example of, once you start moving in the entrepreneurial world, the things that you need are very different from what you need if you're in a traditional, certainly academic environment.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm not. I'm not totally familiar with this process. I know that you really only need to do a 1-year internship in New York State in order to get licensed. And does that last for your lifetime, or is there anything you have to do to keep that up?
That's it. Yeah. If you
Wow.
if you do an internship, you can be licensed, at least when I trained, but it sounds like that's still the case. New York is actually very good in terms of helping you maintain your licensure. So it's not like, some states require you to do a lot of CME to maintain your license, but New York doesn't have any formal CME requirements. So, once you do that internship, you can be licensed, and that gives you a lot of options. Now, again, if you've only done an internship, you're probably not going to be able to get a job at an academic institution. You're probably not going to be, like, if you're still interested in seeing patients, you're probably not going to be able to find a place that will employ you. But there are a lot of environments where just having a license can be useful. And, certainly for me, the part of the reason that I've maintained my license so much is because I'm a licensed physician. I can hire physicians under me. So I can hire all the board certified guys I want. And as far as I'm concerned, Harvard educated, board certified, blah, 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 is a commodity. I can find 100 of those guys, and I can hire them, and, I can have them work under me,
Yeah, I love that. um, the other question I had is, and this is might be personal to your story, so just share however much you feel comfortable. I'm thinking about like the cost of the journey that you took. Like, how did you were you assured that you were going to, like, one of your entrepreneurial pursuits were going to make the cost of medical school and then straight into business school worth it? When were you able to pay off your loans, if you did have loans? Like, kind of how did that factor into your trajectory?
So very good question. Another insightful question. And what I would say, this is a very important generational issue, right? So remember, I'm like a full generation older than you guys. I was born in 1970. I would say that, when I was in medical school or when I was in college, that's when school starts to get really expensive. That's when people go from graduating from school with no debt to people starting to graduate with ridiculous amounts of debt. Now, I was very fortunate in that my dad was a Columbia faculty member, so I had no debt from college, which was very freeing. And medical school, I only had to borrow about half of medical school. And business school, I got sort of like a 20% scholarship. So my debt load wasn't huge. I certainly had debt, but to be very honest, like, I didn't think about that kind of stuff. I sort of came from a bourgeois background. My dad was a doctor. I never worried about money growing up as a kid. So having $70,000 in debt was like, okay, well, that's, I figured that's easy to pay off. So I sort of got lucky that in my first startup that I worked at, I had a good exit. So I always love to tell this story because I'm very proud of this. When I was working at my, that first startup at GLG, every year they would give us a bonus, right? So just imagine a cash bonus of something like 300K okay, or 300K, and then whatever it was after taxes. And every year, my wife went to graduate school, so she had some debt herself. And every year, we would take our bonus check, and my bonus check, and we would split it in half, and half of it would go to debt repayment, and then the other half would go to savings. So we actually paid off our student loans in 3 years, which is like nobody does that, right? And I just remember the story I always like to tell is every time we were going to send the check to the bank, I always told my wife, we can buy a Porsche 911 with this if you want to, right? If you want to, you could have a Porsche instead of paying off your student loans. But we always ended up paying off the student loans instead. But I think it's a great question because, nowadays school is a lot more expensive, right? And I think a lot of people carry much more debt. And I've heard like crazy numbers of, debt numbers that people are graduating from with medical school these days. And I think that informs your decision. If you have to take on 6-figure debt to attend business school, that's a hard one. That's not a clear decision that I would make. But when I was in my position, it was a little bit more clear because the debt overhang was less.
Dr. Neptune, it sounds like in your current role, you're very directly using your medical training.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about what elements of your healthcare expertise were most valuable to you in your previous roles?
Good question. So, one of the things about training to be a physician is you're a professional, right? You're trained to think in a certain way. So even though you may forget, like, if you were to ask me what the protocol is for treating somebody with, acute coronary syndrome, I mean, I'd have to look it up because I've forgotten that. Now, there was a point in my life where I knew every single aspect of the guidelines, but I have never forgotten how to think about somebody who's got acute coronary syndrome. I've never forgotten how to tell the difference between sick, not sick, the 5-second sick, not sick test, the 5-second crazy, not crazy test. Those things stay with you forever. So as a physician now in my current role, I would say that, I'm just learning details now. The infrastructure, the frameworks exist in my brain. Now I'm just filling in, details in terms of like, what's the proper dosing for buprenorphine for somebody who is, on Oxy or OxyContin or something like that. In terms of my previous roles that were non-clinical, what I brought to those positions was an understanding of how the healthcare system worked, an understanding of, the different specialties of medicine. Like for instance, when we were at GLG, a big thing that we had to do was identify all the world's experts across all the different specialties. I knew that. I knew all the medical specialties. I knew all the surgical specialties. I knew like what the really strong schools were or the really strong universities. So, knowledge of the healthcare system, knowledge of healthcare broadly is what I used in my roles where I wasn't taking care of patients directly. So you learn a lot along the way that can be useful. And I would argue that, what I see a lot is people who decide that they don't want to be doctors anymore, who can be very good biotech analysts, right? Because they understand the science and they understand the biology. People can be very good venture capitalists. They can be very good pharma biotech executives, because you really do learn a lot when you're in medical school, and that's strongly applicable outside of a clinical environment.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to be pulling some questions from that were submitted online, but feel free to interrupt if you have one in person as well.
Okay.
Pardon, can I pop in for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Dr. Neptune. I just wanted to talk a bit more about what you had just said and what you mentioned earlier about leaving the faith and kind of your experiences doing that, the challenges, the kind of the pros and cons that you kind of thought through and that kind of thing.
Sure. I mean, again, I'm sort of different in the sense that I always felt like I was different from my med school classmates, how do I say this? On more than one occasion, I was told by some old, crusty, emeritus attending that, that I was, I don't want to use the word uppity, but that I had opinions, right? So I wasn't there. I've always been an independent thinker. I think a lot of that actually comes out of my Columbia experience. So I was sort of always different. But what I will say is, you invest a lot to become a doctor, right? At a minimum, you're doing your 4 years as an undergraduate, and studying organic chemistry and biochem and all that stuff. And then you go to med school and you spend another 4 years, and, you know, you go to residency minimum at least 3 years. You know, people who are doing cardiothoracic surgery, from what I heard, are still doing 7 to 10 years. So it's a long time, you know, you invest a lot. So that's one challenge to leaving the faith, is just like, you know, what do you do with the investment that you make? And what I always try to encourage people to do is, if you think you want to leave, it's probably better to leave earlier than it is to leave later. Like, I know plenty of people who have left halfway through a trauma residency. So, you know, they've done 2 years of surgical residency, they've done 2 years of surgery, they're maybe on the back half of their senior residency. The whole concept of a junior and senior residency is crazy to me. And they're like, I don't love this anymore. I hate I hate my job. I hate myself. So I think, you know, a lot of it involves introspection and asking yourself, do you like doing what you're doing? You know, one of my good friends from medical school, her name is Delphine Taylor. She's an attending at Columbia. She was a journalist, actually, before she became a physician for the New York Times. And Delphine was one of those women that I would look at. I mean, she loved taking care of patients. She loved being in their lives. Like, when the patients would come to the clinic and they would show the pictures of like the grandkids, like, it would, you could see how happy it made her, you know? So like, for her, she never thought about leaving, you know? But for a lot of people, I think a lot of people progress through the program because it's so easy to go to the next step, right? The next step is easily prescribed. As long as you're smart, you can make it to the next step. You know, this, like, once you're in, especially at you're at a good medical school like Rochester, like, you don't really get kicked out of the system, you know? You may not end up where you want it to be, but you don't really get kicked out of the system. It's not an up and out kind of system. Once you're in, you're in. But there are a lot of people who sort of just skate most of the way, saying, hey, listen, I don't know if I really like this or not. So I think a lot of it comes down to, what do you like? What do you love doing? And, you know, if you feel that maybe you don't want to see patients, maybe you don't want to do research, then I think it's a reasonable thing to say, what other things can I do with my medical degree? And I have a friend who is a portfolio manager at a mutual fund here in New York. And he's always said, like, the MD degree, to some extent, you can think about it almost like a law degree. You know, not everybody who gets a law degree is in a courtroom. You know, not everybody who has a law degree is out there trying cases, but the law degree is very useful. There are a lot of people who have law degrees that they use in business, law degrees that they use in a variety of different settings. And I think the medical degree should be thought of in that same way, right? You learn a lot of things and a way of thinking that I think can make you very valuable outside of traditional medical settings. So again, I think a lot of it comes down to, what do you want, where are you, and what are you really feeling about what you're doing, you know? Because the truth is, for me, in my residency, so I did residency in the battle days, right, before the work hour restrictions. So my first rotation in residency, I worked 40 days straight in the CCU without a day off, on call Q3. Every call was like a 36-hour call, right? And I have to tell you, it sucked. I hated it, but I love putting lines into people, right? Like, I love, like, putting paddles on people's chests. Like, at no point did I ever say, I hate this, I want to kill myself. I just say, I would say, this is really hard and I'm not having fun and I can't wait till I get my MBA. But I never said, like, hey, I don't like this, I don't love this. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of it really comes down to asking yourself what you want and where are you and what do you value, and let that inform your decision, you know?
So I have to go because I have a meeting with Dr. Lambert, who's like our head dean for student government. But thank you so much.
All right, Deaton.
Continue to ask Dr. Neptune other questions.
All right, cool, man. See ya.
Great. Another question that we had is, it's a two-part question. For someone with no background in medical entrepreneurship, what are your suggestions for ways to get involved? Also, did your interest in this area influence your choice of training or residency?
Good question. So, I mean, I think the easiest way to get involved is just to go do it, right? So to go, hold on, I got somebody ringing me. Hold on, I got to tell him. 1 second, hold on. This is my partner. On a call, aren't we talking tomorrow? So, you know, look, if you want to be in it, or if you're interested in, the best way to do it is to full immersion, right? So I think we're in a golden era of digital health. There have been billions of dollars invested in digital health companies. Just in New York, we probably have, 100 or more digital health companies. And, a great way to get started is to find a startup where you can work. And I bet you Rochester, Western New York, probably has a decent number of digital health startups, because a lot of this stuff comes out of medical schools. So that would be the most obvious way to start. Now, if you're a medical student, obviously that makes it difficult. So my recommendation would be to try to find a company that you think is interesting. And if, reach out to them and say, hey, listen, I'm a medical student. I don't have a lot of time, but I have this specialized knowledge. Can I help you? Now, obviously, a lot of startups are going to say, hey, go away, kid. They're going to say, we don't need you. But if you reach out to enough people, you might find that, like a startup like mine, if I had a educated, medically aware person who reached out to me and said, hey, I'm willing to work for free, I could find something to do for somebody, So I'd say that that's one way to get involved. Another way is just to read about it. So, some good, probably I'd say the best organization that's doing digital health stuff now is Startup Health is great. And the founders there are Steve Krein and Unity Stokes, good guys. So I would take a look at them. I would also take a look at the Rock Health team. They're also doing some interesting stuff. And, both of those organizations have newsletters, they do conferences, and that's another nice way to get immersed and do so in the context of what is otherwise pretty much a full-time endeavor, which is being a medical student. Answering the second part, digital health wasn't a thing when I really finished my residency in 1990 or in 2000. So that really wasn't the driver of my residency choice. I think that the key driver of my residency choice, as I said, was I was interested in long-term relationships with people as opposed to short-term relationships. I was also under the impression that internal medicine, if you wanted to form a practice, internal medicine, you could always be in private practice in internal medicine, as opposed to emergency medicine, where you're always generally employed by a hospital or health system. And actually, because my father was a pathologist and employed by a hospital, that actually informed a lot of my decision. My dad was like, you do not want to be employed by a hospital. So that sort of informed the decision. And then the last thing, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand about residency, a lot of residency comes down to the people, and who do you like? And I always found, like, my internal medicine colleagues, I really liked them. They were like thoughtful, interesting people who were interested in the things that I was interested in. So, that's why many of my good friends are still people that I did residency with. I really liked urology, but unfortunately at Columbia, the urologist used to round at 4:30 in the morning. I often go to bed at 4:30 in the morning. So I was like, this is never going to work. I will never be a successful urologist. I also was very good at radiology. So, like, one of the things I can do is I can really transform 2D shapes into structures in my brain. So I was very good at that, like, attending level in some things as a medical student. But, like, I didn't want to spend my day talking about the opera, with the radiologist. That's what they did at Columbia, and, walking around in the dark and never interacting with patients. So again, the reason I chose internal medicine was, a lot of it was just the people and what I like doing.
Thank you. Another question, what was your work at HSS? Did you do any clinical work? What does an entrepreneur in residence do?
Oh, I forgot that. I forgot to mention. So HSS, #1 orthopedic hospital in the country. HSS is a very well-run organization. They do a lot of innovative stuff there. And their doctors are very, very entrepreneurial on their own. So HSS has an organization called their Innovation Institute. And it is the place where they figure out how to take technology and get it out of the house. Imagine like a technology transfer office, like a lot of universities have. They also do a lot of commercialization work around forming startups, spinning them out. So there's a company, Proteus Motion. They used to be called Boston Biomotion. So that's a company that I worked closely with when I was at HSS, and the founder did a lot of early stage research at HSS and informed the development of his company. So in my role as an entrepreneur in residence, I was a startup guy, an entrepreneur whose job it was to go in there and be uppity and have attitude and tell them what they should be doing around startups and be a liaison to the startup community. And again, advise startups that were being spun out of HSS or working with HSS in some way to help them add value, get further down the road of the entrepreneurial route.
Thank you. John B., I think you have a question, so feel free to ask.
Hi, Dr. Neptune. My name
Hey.
is John B. Basically, my question is about an MBA degree, and I'm wondering if you could discuss the utility of that degree in your line of work, whether or not you feel it's necessary, and also how you feel about the timing of the MBA. When would be the best time to get one?
Good questions. So utility. So I think you have to think about the MBA as two different things, as a credential and as a type of training. Okay, let me take off my fleece here. It's getting hot. So from a training standpoint, let's start there. I would say that in my MBA program, I really did learn a new language, right? Like I think doctors tend to trash business people and pretend that, business knowledge is not a specialized kind of knowledge, or certainly not as specialized as medical knowledge. But if you think about accounting, if you think about finance, if you think about operations, if you think about marketing, those are all very specialized knowledge realms. And, I feel like I learned a new language in business school. I think that a lot of people who go to business school, if you were a business undergrad, you've worked at McKinsey for 3 years, do you really need to go to business school to learn those concepts? Probably not. You probably know a lot of those concepts already. But for somebody like me who really didn't have any formal business stuff, although, my family business, we had some exposure, I really do feel like I learned a new language. So I do think that that's got utility on its own and, something that's worthwhile. Now, do you have to spend 2 years and spend 150 grand to do that? There are probably other ways to learn about business and learn about the concepts in business. And I always say that, the 3 guys I admire most in healthcare entrepreneurship, Patrick Soon-Shiong in LA, who's the founder of Abraxas, Tom Lee, who is the founder of One Medical, and Richard Park, who is the founder of CityMD. None of those guys has an MBA, right? And they were all able to learn the things that they needed to learn to run their businesses without going to business school. So again, I think you can learn a lot in a business program. Do you need it? No. And remember, there's a cost and a benefit to acquiring that knowledge. Now, if you want to think about the degree as a credential, right? Because remember, in medicine, we're all about credentials and putting, abbreviations after our name. It's actually a pretty useful credential. So for instance, if you see yourself as somebody who wants to be a hospital administrator, the academic medicine world is all about like, where did you go to school and what letters do you have and what, things have you studied? And I think being an MD, MBA, like if I worked in an academic medical center, people would be like, wow, you're a doctor and an MBA. We're going to actually pay you more for that, So I think that as a credential, especially in an academic environment, it can be a very useful credential. It's probably less of an important credential. So like if you went to work for a pharma company, if you are, I had lots of people that I knew who were doctors who got an MBA and then went to work for a pharma company. In many ways, when they went to that pharma company, they were an entry-level MBA and not a physician. Like people were like, okay, that's interesting. You went to medical school, but as far as we're concerned, you're, an entry-level MBA. So I think, the value of the MBA depends as a credential depends on where you are. And it's probably most valuable in a hospital environment if you're in the role of some kind of administrator or manager.
Thank you for that. Just a follow-up question. I'm wondering, what are the other ways to learn the new language that is contained within the MBA without having to go to business school? How would one start to even go about that?
I mean, look, we live in a total, the world has been transformed. Like, I mean, remember when I was in medical school, I remember first using email when I was in medical school, like in 1995 or 1996. You guys have grown up with the internet. And the truth is, a lot of that content that you need to learn, I'm sure you can find a full online MBA curriculum online. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Khan Academy had, a full MBA or mini MBA course load. So you can do that. You can find the information online. And, the one thing you do really well as a medical student is you learn, right? The ability to learn, incorporate, synthesize new concepts. I bet you, in 50 hours of watching Khan Academy business classes, you could learn a lot of the stuff that I've learned already. So if you wanted just to learn the basic concepts, I'm sure you can find that stuff online for free or almost free.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Neptune. Another question. Have you had to abandon any projects? How do you know when to abandon?
It's hard. Well, you almost never, I wouldn't say that abandon is the right word. I think more often than not, you're shutting down your startup, right? And you're shutting down your startup because you just haven't been able to generate profit, right? You haven't been able to generate enough. Your revenue hasn't been able to exceed your expenses enough so that you can pay yourself and, and hire a team and keep your team paid. So, generally that's why you shut down your business. And, it happens, right? If you look at, if you look at the world of venture capital, so venture capital companies invest in promising startup companies, and they generally have the most exhaustive process for identifying startups. For every 10 startups that venture capitalists invest in, at least 6 or 7 are going to go to zero, are going to go completely out of business, with maybe 1 out of 10 being a real success. So really, failure is your default position and what you have to prepare yourself for. And I think, again, for a lot of people in medical school, like if you were your high school valedictorian, you graduated from college magna cum laude, you've been successful your whole life, it can be very, very jarring to fail in a startup and have to shut something down. So, but it's part of the game. And I think it becomes obvious to most people if their startup is not working. And if nothing ventured, nothing gained. You have to try, and the market will tell you if they like what you're doing or not.
Thank you. There's another question that's talking about
Helogica.
Helogica.
Uh-huh.
I believe that might be from your LinkedIn.
Yep.
So the question is, did the acquisition come out of a pre-existing relationship? What are your thoughts on the topic of acquisition in general as an entrepreneur?
No, they reached out to us. We didn't know them. We didn't know anybody there. They reached out to us. It was a small acquisition, but we were able to give money back to our investors. And look, that's when you form a startup, especially if it's a venture-backed startup, most of the time, if you're going to have a successful outcome, it's going to be because your company was acquired. So, look, I dream of my current business being acquired for $100 million by, some larger player with deeper pockets. And that's, for people in the startup world, that's actually a good outcome. If you have 5 exits, 5 acquisitions on your resume, you've been a very successful entrepreneur.
Thank you. I think Michelle has a question.
Hi, yes. Hi, Dr. Neptune. First of all, thank you for giving this talk to us. And I guess my question is about location.
Mm-hmm.
So how much does location matter for someone trying to enter the medical entrepreneurship landscape? And if you were in our position, how much would you let that influence your choice of where you would rank going to residency?
Good question. So I think there's a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic answer to that question. I think, pre-pandemic, as I said, I think there's a lot of medical or digital health entrepreneurship that's going on around the country, right? I think that anywhere that there's a major academic center, especially if there's a bunch of academic centers in the same city, you'll see very interesting things going on in terms of innovation. But probably where you're going to have the best opportunities is in cities where you're seeing clustering, where you see lots and lots of companies, where you see not only the founders, but you're seeing the institutions, where you're seeing the venture capital. So I think New York is probably number 1 at this point. San Francisco, Bay Area is also very interesting, sort of 2 different approaches. But LA is interesting. Chicago is interesting. Houston's interesting. Atlanta's interesting. And and no surprise, those are all good places to be doing your residency. So I think that any major city where you go, you could probably find a good hub. I forgot to mention Boston as well, obviously. So I think that that's the case. I mean, post-pandemic, I still think it's the case that those places are still going to be your strongholds for innovation, but I think you may be able to participate in a virtual way that you couldn't do pre-pandemic, right? I think that now everybody is totally rethinking what work means and what it means to collaborate. And I think people are much more comfortable collaborating virtually. So maybe you might end up, let's say you end up in Timbuktu, right? Wherever you end up, you still might be able to participate just through virtual means. But, as you guys probably know, the in-person interaction still means so much. And hopefully as we get past the pandemic, or at least this acute phase of the pandemic, we can get back to doing a lot more in-person stuff.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neptune. I have another question. It's not a follow-up, slightly unrelated. So what do you see the utility of an MD PhD in, I guess, medical entrepreneurship or startups, as opposed to an MD MBA or an MD?
Good question. I'm not a mud FUD expert, although many of my friends from medical school were mud FUDs. I would say that, if the MD MBA is a long path to getting to entrepreneurship, the MD PhD is a really long path to getting to entrepreneurship, right? Because probably even if you're moving quickly through your PhD program, that's still 4 or 5 years. So it's a long way to go. That said, a lot of people in their PhD programs, especially if you're doing a PhD program that's got some interesting research that you can translate, you actually might be able to spawn a startup out of your PhD thesis in a way that you probably couldn't do in an MBA program. So I think probably a lot of it comes down to what you do in your PhD. Like, for instance, if you're doing a computer science PhD, right, or an informatics PhD or something like that, you might have some very interesting things that come out of that could easily turn into startup companies. So, again, it's a longer route, but you might actually have some genuine IP that comes out of that.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Great. Are there any other questions? I have one more question from online that would be nice to round off the session.
I've got one. Sorry, I don't know how to.
Okay, I guess
you can
Abe,
go
you
ahead, whoever else that was.
And then
sure.
Sarush can go.
Hi, Dr. Neptune. My name is Abe. Thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. So you mentioned a few people who you kind of admire a little bit ago, with an example being Dr. Richard Park.
Uh-huh.
I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on what the kind of secret to their success was? And in general, what characteristics or traits do you think, or have you seen kind of set apart individuals in your field?
So let's talk about Rich Park, because I've gotten to know Rich over the last couple of years. So again, the founder of CityMD, the market leader in urgent care, started in New York, now spreading across the country. Recently sold that company in a private equity transaction. So Rich is very interesting, right? So Rich's family is very, very typical Korean American experience. He's from I think somewhere in Queens, I can't remember. And his family growing up, they were involved in the retail space. Like they had a couple stores, they had a couple different businesses. So Rich's background was, he very much had like a retail background as his formative experience. Like that's what he talked about at the dinner table with his family, right? That's what they talked about in the house. They didn't talk about medicine. His dad wasn't a doctor like my dad. So what's interesting about him is that he comes into his medical training. He went to Stuyvesant, then he went to, I can't remember where he went to college. He went to Penn for college, then he went to Einstein for residency. I think he always had in his mind the fact that, hey, I can apply some of this retail stuff that I learned when I was a kid growing up to doing a business that I run, that I own, So I think that maybe a thing that's useful to have is having some kind of experience before you go to medical school that exposes you to this, right? Because I would argue that for a lot of us, and I sort of will pull myself out of that us, but how many people do you know, go through medical school, they never really, or go through college, they never really think about any other options, they never really get any other exposure, then they go to residency and, or medical school, then residency. I think Rich, because he had that experience, was always sort of head up and looking at other opportunities and saying, well, maybe I can go out and do this on my own. And as I think about Tom Lee, I know Tom pretty well. I've never met Patrick Soon-Shiong, but I know Tom pretty well. And he's another guy who is like, I don't know if he had the same kind of background. I can't remember where Tom is from, but he was always a guy who was asking, like, what more can I be doing? Like, what other things can I be doing? And I think the key thing you really have to avoid if you want to be an entrepreneur, and remember, there's nothing wrong with following the traditional medical path to being the chairman of department of whatever specialty you train in. There's nothing wrong with that. That's very noble. But I think that if you want to be an entrepreneur, you're probably not on that path, right? You're probably picking your head up and looking around and saying, okay, well, what else is going on here? What other cool, sexy things could I be doing, So if anything, I'd say it's just the willingness to consider other opportunities and to think beyond what you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Neptune, thank you so much for coming. And I think you also mostly just answered my question, or at least parts of it. But other than exposure and just keeping your eyes open and your head on a swivel, looking for new opportunities all the time, do you have any advice for someone who does enjoy the patient care aspect of things a lot and sees themselves maybe in like a somewhat traditional medical path, however, is also interested in entrepreneurship and getting involved more heavily in that? Is there a middle ground, and do you have any colleagues or anyone who has kind of embodied that path?
Good question. I mean, look, what I always tell people is, like, if you love taking care of patients, if you love being in the clinic, if you love being in the OR, if you love doing whatever it is, right? And a lot of people do love that. Nothing you will do outside of medicine, I think, can ever replace that, right? And if you love it, that means you made the right choice, that you made the right choice in going to medical school and doing a residency. So again, if you love doing what you're doing, keep doing that. I think if you want to get involved, probably the best way is to do so on a part-time basis. So, a lot of these startups need advisors. So, being a startup advisor is something you can do. You can be an investor, right? A lot of startups need to raise money. Doctors do pretty well. So lots of startups have their first investors as, your Uncle Fred, who invests $50,000 in the company. And it's fun being an investor. You probably lose your money, but, it's fun to be an investor in a company and get to know the company and get to know the founders and get to know the space. So I think those are at least two ways to get involved, as an investor and as an advisor. And you'd be surprised. There are lots of people who figure out how to do both. I was never very good at doing that. I was always about, like, I'm either one thing or the other, but there are a decent number of people who have, like, their full-time faculty clinical job, and they're pursuing some side hustle on the side.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, thank you again, Dr. Neptune. I guess we have 5 minutes, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So there's just one question that might be good for rounding off the session that was submitted online. It's what advice would you give your younger self?
When you're an entrepreneur and you're getting your ass kicked on any given day, I will often think about that. What would I do differently? What advice would I give myself? I honestly don't know what I would have really done differently. I think one thing, I might not have gone to get an MBA, right? So for instance, if I had finished my residency in 95, let's say, when the dot-com boom was really starting to build in New York, you could have had a good outcome going to WebMD without an MBA, or I could have had a good outcome going without an MBA. So, maybe in another life I might rethink, the MBA part. But again, I think I've benefited a lot having the MBA. I've made a lot more money because of having the MBA, for sure. Sometimes you can ask yourself, should I've done a whole residency instead of maybe just, or should I've done just an internship instead of a whole residency? But, you know, I feel like I learned a lot in terms of being a doctor, and I feel like I'm a real doctor, and I know what I'm talking about. You know, maybe some of the opportunities that we pursued, like the clinical trials opportunity, was interesting, but I don't think we were a good fit for that. In retrospect, I think I might have pursued a different opportunity at that time. But you know, it's easy to call in retrospect decisions that you made, you know. And I think that for the most part, I think I've been pretty happy. I mean, I'd love to be richer. I'd love to, you know, be living in a bigger apartment. But you know, those are the decisions I've made. And for the most part, I think I'm happier doing this than I would say. And I'll be really honest here. And maybe this is not. I don't want to end on this point. So let's find another question. But I would say that, you know, I have a lot of people that I know who are unhappy. You know, a lot of doctors who are successful, you know, they do well, and they're professors of this, and you know, they have a nice house in the suburbs. But I know a lot of people who are really unhappy, and I've read a stat somewhere that 9 out of 10 doctors would not recommend that their children become doctors. That's terrible, you know. And I think that implies that there are a lot of physicians who are doing things that don't make them happy. At least for me, you know, again, you know, there are days where I'm you know, I'm getting punched in the face for some reason or another, but it's fun, and I feel like I have control, and I'm master of my own destiny. So I think, you know, again, it goes back to, I can't remember the guy who asked the question about the decision making. I think a lot of it comes down to doing the things that you like and that take advantage of your skills and your knowledge and your gifts, and you know, figuring out how to get there, you know.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Neptune. That pretty much rounds up the hour. And we all really, really appreciate your time, and we learned a lot from you today. If you would be willing, we can perhaps distribute your email, but we can talk offline about that before that happens. So again, we really appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for joining.
Sure. And I'm happy to share my email. So just my email is my first name, last name @gmail.com. So JeanLucNeptune So just
Great. Thank you.
first name, no hyphen, no dots, no nothing. Jean-Luc Neptune @gmail.com.
Perfect. I'll send that out as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Neptune.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, enjoy. You guys are the future of medicine. So please, you know, take advantage of this time. This is a unique time in your life, and learn as much as you can. And I know it sucks sometimes, you know, peering at that anatomy book, but you know, you guys are our future. So take care of yourself.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Take care.